Now, I want to describe the fellow who hasn't committed the unpardonable sin. He's uncertain whether he has or not, and is all badly confused about what the unpardonable sin is. You can write his name mighty high. He hasn't committed it. If he had, he wouldn't be uncertain at all. He wouldn't know he hadn't. And he wouldn't be confused. He would be as clear as daylight that he was one of the saints, and would be getting a three-way mirror to look at his head in order that he might know what size crown over it. He'd be perfectly sure of himself. But the fellow who's uncertain and confused and downcast and in trouble. I went to a doctor one time years ago, this in Cleveland too. Went to a doctor, oh, good many years ago. I was having pains. And he sat me down and talked with me. He said, I can tell you fellas when I see you come through the door. I said, what is it? I said, nerves. And he gave me a dad and fixed me up and sent me out. But I didn't like that so well. I had a look about me like a dyspeptic. I didn't know I looked like a dyspeptic. I got over that and don't have trouble anymore. But I did, and he knew me. He said, I know you fellas when I see you coming. I didn't like to think I fell into a category. But I know these people who think they've committed the unpardonable sin. The phone will ring, Tozer, yes. Well, this is so-and-so, never heard of it. Could I see you next week? Yes. Well, what's time convenient for you? Well, could it be to 1 o'clock? I work until noon. Yeah, all right. 1 o'clock. So I hurry through my lunch hour and come back at 1 o'clock. And he comes in. I know him when he crosses the threshold. He's a spiritual dyspeptic. He is just in one little easy jump of a happy, joyous Christian life, but he's as gloomy, dyspeptic. He thinks he's committed the unpardonable sin. Always be sure he hasn't. For if he had, he would make broad his phylacteries and make big his Bible and bulge his tracts, and would come in without a trace of penitence, without a trace of humility. He hadn't committed the unpardonable sin. He'd never think of it. So the fellow who's discouraged and gloomy and despondent and worried about himself, don't bother your head about him. Pray that God will show him the facts. He hadn't committed the unpardonable sin. And the fellow that goes around asking questions and writing in the Moody Monthly and King's Business, our hope. Someone wanting to know what's the unpardonable sin. He hasn't committed it. You never heard of any of those Pharisees coming to Jesus and saying, oh, Master, I'm afraid I've committed the unpardonable sin. Never one of them. None of those rabbis ever came to him and said, oh, Master, I'm afraid I've gone to the point of no return. Not one of them. If anybody had come to Jesus like that, and they might easily have, and probably did, some of them, he'd have said, Father forgives and pardons all sins unto the sons of men. Thou canst believe, to let him out into the light. So anybody who's worried about whether he has committed the unpardonable sin hasn't. Anybody who's uncertain and confused hasn't. Anybody who's distressed to the point where he's asking questions and asking people to pray for him, he hasn't. Anybody who's become so frightened he can't pray anymore, and I've met some of them. They think they've committed the unpardonable sin, and they always go to the Bible and look up the verses that do them harm. They always look up the passage that says, the 10th of Hebrews and the 6th of Hebrews, there remaineth therefore no more sacrifice for sin. They wag their head and go out. If that described them, they'd never have come in. The self-righteous man never worries that there's no more sacrifice for sin. The self-righteous man whose spiritual life has deteriorated until he's capable of committing the unpardonable sin, he never worries for fear there's no hope for him. And he's never frightened. And pray, sure he can pray. He can pray to the Father he knows is his friend, because he's got the covenant. But in his deep heart of hearts, he doesn't know God from the devil. In his deep heart of hearts, he doesn't know good from evil. He only knows external good and external evil, but he's never become acquainted with the depth of depravity in his own heart. And he'd crucify God before he would admit himself a sinner. It's all right for you to admit yourself a generic sinner. Many a man who believes in total depravity that thinks it's touched everybody but him. Now, if you ask him, he'd say, oh, certainly, certainly. I was born in sin, conceived in iniquity, and all my righteousness are filthy rags. But he doesn't believe that. He's lying to his own soul. Cross him sometime. Challenge him sometime. Charge him with doing something wrong sometime. See what he'll do. Blow up, turn red, curse you out. Well, the inability to feel spiritual distress is a mark of a terrible condition. I don't say it's a proof of the unpardonable sin. I say it's a proof that we're on our way to it. Oh, I can't say too often. If you can be sorry for sin, thank God for the ability to be sorry. Some people can't. Some religious people can never be sorry. Their religion lies in texts, forms. In fact, they were sprinkled, took communion, confirmed. But there's never been anything inside. And they're deteriorating fast. Wouldn't you feel terrible if a doctor would say to you, I'm awfully sorry to tell you, I wish you'd have bring your wife down. You and your wife would sit there and the doctor or specialist would say to you, now I'm sorry to tell you this, but your brain is deteriorating. You've got a strange disease and the cells are breaking down one after the other, and before very long, you won't even be able to tell your own name. You won't know your people. Wouldn't you go home blue? Wouldn't that be awful? I'd go home and say to my people, well, that's what he told me. Now expect anything from here on in. And how much worse to know that by self-righteousness and self-love and a brassy unwillingness ever to admit we're wrong, basically wrong, that deterioration's taking place in many lives, religious lives. I don't say saved people. Saved people can't commit the unpardonable sin. The saved man cannot commit the unpardonable sin. These were not saved people, they were religious people. There's a vast difference. But to know that that deterioration takes place, to know that it's taking place, and little by little the spirit is getting obtuse, eyes are going out, and blindness is coming on, deafness is taking over. Pretty soon it'll be confined within its own skull in darkness. How terrible. But nobody ever knows that. Nobody ever knows it because the people it's happening to would laugh at me for preaching it and scorn and curse Jesus for saying so. Say, you got the devil. I'm a Jew. Look at me, circumcised the 8th day. My lineage is in the temple. I know who I'm born of. I'm not born of fornication. What are you talking about? Didn't I say you were a devil and were crazy? He knew who he was. I'm a Methodist. I'm a Baptist. I heard Dr. Simpson preach. I give commissions. I prayed all night one night with Leonard Ravenhill. Sure you did. But you'll never believe